whatever reason, a few people have alerted me to a paper from a philosophy professor on evidential objections to atheism. It's from 2019, so I don't know why folks have been sharing this with me over the last couple months. Maybe some believer in social media somewhere started bragging about how a Christian had published evidence against atheism. I don't know. It wasn't published to any journal. It was just posted to academia.edu, which I understand anybody can do, although this was from an actual academic, and ResearchGate has a reference to it, and somebody cited it as if it had been peer-reviewed. I'm not a philosopher myself, and in a moment I think you'll see why I don't want to be one. But let's go ahead and review that paper anyway. I'll put the link to it in the description below so that you can all check it and be sure that I'm reading it correctly. Now, the only way I could interpret the promise of evidential objections to atheism is that she should have to present evidence for theism, meaning a list of one or more objectively verifiable facts indicating the existence of one or more gods. But of course, since there isn't any actual factual evidence implying any such thing, nor anything of the so-called supernatural whatsoever, then that's obviously not what the author meant to do. Religion reverses everything, and religious believers always flip everything upside down, being seemingly unable to comprehend patterns of emergence arising from the bottom up, insisting instead on an invisible orchestrator administrating things from the top down. But worse, believers also have a tendency to think backward, shifting the burden of proof away from themselves, because believers hate nothing more than the burden of proof. And the author of this argument pleads that theism is rational or justified, or that it would be if she could present evidence against atheism. Not evidence for theism, as she should do, but evidence against the absence of theism, reversing everything on the assumption that doing so would shift the burden of proof onto atheists. Believers have a faith-based belief system with required beliefs and prohibited beliefs where they are not allowed the literally reasonable liberty of free thought, as some of them know that it's only make-believe, that there's no way to substantiate their assertions, which is their obligation. To my experience, Christianity is largely about denying responsibility. If, for example, you don't actually have to help anyone, you can just wish upon a star that they'll get the help that they need somehow, and then you can pretend as if you've done something when you haven't. And neither do you have to atone for however you've wronged anyone, because you can just pretend that your magic imaginary friend has forgiven you, because of course he has. He hates everything you do for the same reasons that you do. And he already fully understands from your perspective why those punks deserved whatever you did to them. And you don't have to be responsible for the inevitable, eventual result of your continued uncorrected course of misdirection. And it doesn't matter if our starving kids inherit a barren, polluted, overpopulated, overheated hellscape, because Jesus is going to come back real soon and ruin everything anyway. So if none of those things matter, then why would you honor your obligation to show how you know that anything you claim is really the truth like you say it is? Believers know there is no evidence or logic to support their belief in any God. So all they can do is try to shift the burden of proof onto the atheists, as if it's up to us to prove that there is not a God, as if it is up to the unbeliever to disprove every delusion, hallucination, or fever dream that any drugged out or demented lunatic can imagine. No, that's not how logic works. That's not how evidence works. Positive claims require positive evidence. You have to be able to show that whatever you say is true. You have to be able to show the truth of it. Otherwise, it's not true. Unsupported assertions are both empty and indefensible, having no more credence than claims that have already been proven wrong. Negative claims can carry a burden of proof too, and I come prepared to meet that burden. But it isn't necessary if it is in response to an unsupported assertion. Then we rely on Hitchens' razor, that what is asserted without evidence may be dismissed without evidence, especially when there is not even a possibility that the empty assertions could be true, and there's no way that the claimant could know whether it is true. Show me how you know that, how I can know it too. Otherwise, if you can't show it, you don't know it. You're just talking out of your ass. And so far, rather than present anything evidential in support of her God, The professor wants to present arguments instead of evidence, which believers always do because that's all they've got. And they're not even arguments for a God, but against the non-belief in a God, because believers think backward, and it only gets worse from there. Of course, she misdefines what atheism is, which is to be expected because she's a philosophy professor, and philosophers usually use a different definition than most atheists do. She defines atheism as a rejection of the proposition that there is a God, interpreted as a claim that there is no God. A denial of theism rather than a denial of belief in the unsupported assertions of theism, which is how the vast majority of atheists have defined themselves for centuries. In 1674, Matthias Knudsen was the first person to self-identify as an atheist for the reason that he does not believe that there is a God, not that he believes that there is not a God. He specified, and which is another point that believers love to twist around. In the 1770s, Baron d'Holbach, the father of atheism, did the same, declaring that atheism means not having a belief in God as opposed to believing that there is not a God. Both men made up different words to define someone who also has a belief that no gods exist. But they both said that atheism means having no belief that there is one. The difference is subtle but important. Baron d'Holbach even said that all children are born atheists because they have no idea of God. How can you have a belief in something if you've never heard of it or aren't even aware of the concept? Philosophers, however, say that there's no utility in that definition, but that's where all the utility is. Because historically, politicians and theologians have been sadly way too concerned with the question, do you believe in God? Yes equals theist, in which case all may be forgiven. No equals atheist, in which case you are without theism, and you'll be punished in this life and the next. And this is why every atheist organization today still defines themselves as unbelievers, the way atheism was originally and commonly defined decades before Thomas Huxley confused matters with his awkward invention of the word agnostic, which did not provide utility. It only led to arguments that previously could have been easily avoided, arguments that are so pointless that they only appeal to philosophers. Imagine standing at the pearly gates. You're trying to get into heaven, and St. Peter is going to judge you over this question, do you believe in God? And imagine that somebody standing there says, well, I'm an agnostic, so I don't have a belief that there is a God, but I don't have a belief that there's not one either. And St. Peter would simply reply, you don't believe in God, so to hell with you, atheist. Do you believe in God? Yes or no? That's all that matters. So whether you also have a belief that there is no God doesn't matter to anyone, except philosophers, and only because they're looking for something to argue about endlessly. So, after applying the restrictive philosophical definition of atheism, this particular professor also applied her own special definition of God. She defines deities in the big G and little g sense, depending on whether we're talking about a single omni-everything uber-galactic overlord, which she calls global theism, or whether we're talking about some lesser deity, which she refers to as local theism. The argument being that she thinks that atheists have to specify which forms of deity we disbelieve in, or as she put it, which forms of theism we target. Because remember, religion reverses everything, even in the minds of PhD philosophy professors. So she doesn't understand that she's attacking us for not believing the same lies that she does. She thinks that we're attacking her because Christians have to be persecuted in all things. That's their great goal. But she thinks that we're attacking her belief in a God with our opposing belief that there is no God. And while many of us, myself included, do have a belief that there is no God, we are a subset of the larger category of atheists who collectively have no belief that there is a God. There is no utility in a definition that excludes the larger body to only focus on the subset, only focus on one of the subsets. So the professor argues that we should be atheist against the little g, lesser deities that she calls local gods, the ones she doesn't believe in either, but that we should not be atheist against the big G global God that she believes in, because she says her big G deity is a more pressing position to refute. She thinks that's significant, but it really doesn't matter. Can you show any actual factual evidence that there is any God at all? Big or little, either one, doesn't matter. You know, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Tony Stark is an atheist, or he was in the beginning, but he really can't be now that he's met both Thor and Loki. He has to admit that at least those two gods exist and that the miracles or magic they perform really works. And Doctor Strange showed him the same thing, that there is a supernatural. And that provides the necessary precedent or parallel or verified phenomenon to show that there's at least a possibility of a big G God too. And after Iron Man had seen what Thanos could do with the Infinity Gauntlet, then he would have to admit that there are much greater gods than those local to Asgard. But we don't live in a comic book movie. We live in a seemingly entirely natural reality in which believers cannot show that there is any truth to their beliefs at all. So ultimately, it comes down to this. The theist says that everything that happens, however it happened, only happened because some magical anthropomorphic immortal wanted it to happen, because a deity's wishes come true just because he wants them to, just because he wishes for it. And that's how things happen, with no rhyme or reason or mechanism at all, just pure fucking magic, by which I mean the supernatural. You know, magical miracles, miraculous magic, they're the same thing. Supernatural powers affecting natural phenomena. That's what magic is. And we are expected to assume that the magical anthropomorphic immortal exists simply because someone said so. Someone who couldn't possibly know what they're talking about. But we're just supposed to believe them anyway, and believe them completely, without question, reservation, or reason. And our problem with this is illustrated by how the Devil's Dictionary defines faith. Belief without evidence in what is told by one who speaks without knowledge of things without parallel. So theists make these long lists of empty, unsupported assertions of indefensible fantasy, pretending to know all these things that no one even can know. But we're just supposed to blindly believe impossible nonsense for no good reason, simply because some rando said so, because they're not thinking logically, and they don't want us to think logically either. But the atheist response is, I don't believe you. And a subset of those implicit or weak atheists, according to philosophers, might also be explicit or strong atheists by adding, and I think you're full of shit. So how is the professor going to present evidential objections to I don't believe you? Because you've provided no reason or way that we could believe you. Does she ever provide the evidential objections she promised? Of course not. She doesn't have any. But listen to what she gives us instead. Now that we've got the wrong idea about atheism and the wrong idea about God, we move into wrong ideas about evidence, because believers like to redefine that too. They like to define it to mean not evidence. They only give arguments instead of evidence, which again is what believers typically do. They don't have anything else, and faith means never admitting when you're wrong. So they got to keep plodding along. The first argument in lieu of evidence is the Kalam cosmological argument, though the professor doesn't call it that. It is the notion that if the universe had a beginning, then that is somehow an argument against atheism, as if that assumption implies a God, which it doesn't. Believers even insist that it implies the Bible God, despite the fact that it contradicts the Bible, just as everything contradicts the Bible, and even the Bible contradicts the Bible. And that would be a hint of some of my evidential objections to theism. In order to qualify as evidence, and thus be an evidential objection, it must be both objectively true and indicative. Religious claims are never both of these things at the same time. They are often neither true nor indicative, and this is one example of failing both criteria. The Kalam cosmological argument is a collection of fallacies that ignores modern cosmology. Even in models of cosmogony that have a singularity, it is eternal. In some concepts, there is no time before the Big Bang. It's like going south of the South Pole. It is definitively impossible. In other models, there can be a time before cosmic inflation, but there is never a time before the singularity, when there was no singularity. Believers accuse us all the time of believing that everything came from nothing, but I don't know any atheist alive who believes there was ever absolutely nothing. Many of them don't believe it's possible for there to be absolutely nothing. Not even Lawrence Krauss believes in an absolute philosophical nothing. I've spoken to a few cosmologists, and while none of them hold to a steady state, they usually say that the universe is, in some sense, eternal in both directions. that it never had a temporal beginning, and that it was never created, because material energy cannot be created or destroyed. The philosopher's next argument instead of evidence is the conflation that mere belief should count as knowledge, what I call the fourth foundational falsehood of creationism, and the assumption that the fact that you believe something is evidence that it's true, because the question-begging fallacy is ubiquitous throughout all religious arguments. She says that hallucinations should count as evidence too, in the sense of having a reason to believe that the thing you see is real. And I would agree with that up to a point, except that that's only an example of subjective evidence, which, and I have to explain this to Christians all the time, subjective evidence is only evidence to the subject, not to me or anyone else. So when you claim evidence, I can't be forced to admit that you have subjective evidence when you have a subjective impression. It's not reproducible. It's not, I can't show that it's valid. There's no way to show that there's any truth to it. It's just something you believe, and that's it. But this person says what you believe, that's evidence somehow. Your hallucination or misunderstood assumption or subjective opinion cannot compete with demonstrable fact. Evidence is commonly defined as a fact that indicates. So we need something that we can both show and thus know to be true that also indicates one position or eliminates another. The next argument from this PhD lecturer in philosophy is an informal logical fallacy known as an appeal to popularity. She actually argues, premise one, that belief in God is nearly universal. Premise two, that if any given proposition is nearly universal, then it must be true. Premise three, so if nearly everyone believes in God, then God must exist. She then has the conclusion that nearly everyone believes in God, therefore God exists. Senior lecturer, PhD professor of philosophy, and yet she really said that, all that. Read it. None of her premises are true. And to be fair, she admits that premise 2 and 3 are faulty, because thousands of years ago, when everyone believed that the world was flat, it still wasn't flat. So she already knows that this is a bad argument, though she makes it anyway. And she doesn't realize that her first premise is faulty too. Belief in God is not nearly universal. Yes, you had primitive societies once upon a time that didn't understand anything and commonly believed in magic, because anyone who didn't believe in magic was hunted down and killed on the word of one or two witnesses, just like the Bible says. So that as a simple matter of population genetics, with everyone killing off all the infidels, it wasn't long until there weren't any skeptics left, and everyone remaining were credulous gullible believers. Now, the professor also admits the inconsistency of what she just called a nearly universal belief, because she acknowledges that there are nearly as many Muslims as Christians, and Christianity and Islam are different enough that Christians are going to Muslim hell for believing that Jesus is the Son of God or God made flesh, and Muslims are going to Christian hell for not believing that. And there's another problem too. Christianity is only the world's leading religion if Catholics are included. But many Protestants insist that Catholics are not Christian. They're not really Christians. They're just Mary worshiping pagans, in which case Islam is the world's dominant religion. And that would make Hinduism the second largest religion, while Christianity moves from first place to fourth place after Catholicism. Being in fourth place won't make Christian nationalists or Christian dominionists happy at all. But it gets even worse than that, because if Catholics are not Christian, then Islam would be the world's most popular religion, with 21% of the world behind them, not accounting for attenuation, which we'll talk about in a moment. And if we include unbelievers, the non-religious, those who realize they're atheists, combined with those who may be atheists but who don't yet know what that means, or maybe they identify as humanists or agnostics or are otherwise apathetic to religious nonsense, the irreligious are the second largest perspective on religion, with as much as 16% of the global populace, more than Catholicism, more than true Christianity, the Protestants that think they're the special ones. And one could argue that Christians collectively, and Muslims too, believe in the same God, sort of, though religious leaders say otherwise. And one of the few things that rabbis and imams agree on is that Jews and Muslims both worship the same God, but the Christians have a different one. In which case, there goes the supermajority that the professor was arguing for. She said that 60% counted as nearly universal, which it doesn't. It's barely over half. Jews, Zoroastrians, and Sikhs all have entirely different notions of God. Ahura Mazda is the God of Zarathustra, not the God of Abraham. But even if we were to lump all of these monotheistic religions together the way the professor wants to do, you still don't have that supermajority. 54% is less than the 60% the professor argued for. It's barely a majority at all. Then we have to look at everyone else. No one is going to pretend as if the Hindu gods or the Chinese gods or the pagan gods are the same as our new composite god of monotheism. The professor even distinguished them herself when she separated local gods from the global god, which turned out to be more than one global god, depending on locality. She argued that belief in God was nearly universal, but in reality, nearly half of the world does not believe in what she calls global theism. So that argument is dead too. Islam is the fastest growing religion according to birth rates, but atheism may be growing faster than any religion, though it's through attenuation rather than birth rates, which is harder to find data for. The professor argued that over 90% of the world believes in some sort of deity, but she didn't get that right either, and not just because she failed to account for the declared unbelievers on this chart. Remember also that Buddhism is a largely atheist religion. Over a third of Buddhists don't believe in any God. And then there are many others who show up in the polls as Jewish or even Hindu who still identify with their traditional religions culturally, but when pressed, confess that they don't actually believe in any gods at all. So now unbelievers rise to at least 20%. Then another 10% of Christians don't believe in God. There's a Methodist minister in Austin, Texas, who identifies as non-theist. We'll figure that out. And I think he must be a philosopher because he thinks there's a difference between non-theist and atheist. It's hard to know how many Muslims don't believe in God because Sharia countries have laws to silence apostasy. But we still have stats to show that atheism is on the rise even in Islam, even in Saudi Arabia, where apostasy could get you killed. These are people who are no longer able to just go through the motions and pretend anymore. If there were evidential objections to atheism, these people would want to know about it. But they've already looked deeply and broadly, and there is none. I know because I've looked too. This is not a position I came to quickly or lightly. But the professor goes on, and her argument still gets worse. Interestingly, she acknowledges that the more educated one is, the more likely they are to be atheist, and that levels of atheism are especially high among scholars with advanced academic degrees. But she doesn't even take a moment to ponder why that is. Instead, she argues that if you simply ignore that fact, then, she says, it may not be rational to be atheist anymore if you remember that among all the less educated masses, there are still more believers than not. Because remember, she thinks that however many people believe something matters to whether it's true or not. And the reasoning she gives, if I may be inappropriately polite in calling it reasoning, is that she thinks that the belief itself should be evidence that the belief is true, which is another circular assumption. But then she increases the spin on that by saying that your level of conviction should be counted as evidence also, another line of evidence separate from the belief itself. As if the fact that you believe is evidence and the fact that you're really convinced of your belief is somehow more evidence. And then to make it even worse, she says that biases should be considered a third line of evidence. Although, she doesn't call it bias. Instead, she refers to self-doubt. And her explanation describes bias. She says that if you doubt your conviction, then you should just stop doubting yourself and double down on the confidence you have in your pre-existing belief in your God's existence. As if the circular assumption is evidence of itself, and your confidence is, and your bias are different lines of evidence on top of that. I'm not kidding. The link is below. Read it for yourself. It's a stunningly bad argument. Then she mentions the evolutionary explanation that the cognitive mechanisms that give rise to religious belief are hyperactive and unreliable, leading to an erroneous attribution of agency. In which case, what she calls common consent, and the rest of us recognize as the bandwagon fallacy, has no evidential value, because it doesn't. But she simply ignores that too, on the excuse that cognitive science of religion is currently not in a position to allow for such sweeping claims. Well, of course, religion has never been in a position to evaluate evidence that challenges the faith. And then she says that ignoring all the evidence that she just dismissed without justification, she then says that the wide prevalence of theistic belief constitutes evidence against global atheism. No, it doesn't. As she already admitted earlier, and that the popularity of belief does not imply that the belief is true, and she has no excuse for disregarding the evidence that contradicts her belief, especially since she had just said on the previous page that we cannot doubt our epistemic peers just because we find their assessments ludicrous. Well, of course we can, but she's still contradicting herself by saying both of these things in the same paper and breaking her own rules each time. Then she argues that testimony should qualify as evidence, particularly testimonies regarding religious experiences. Because Christians don't just pretend to know things they don't know. They also pretend to witness things they've never seen. Have you ever heard them witnessing to each other? And their testimonies or their religious experiences directly contradict that of Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and everyone else, especially pagans. So again, I have to explain to Christians all the time that arguments are not evidence, especially not when they're logically fallacious, and lies are not evidence either. Now, the professor says that the only reasonable explanation that could be offered by what she calls a naturalist and I call a rationalist is that people who report these religious experiences are being deliberately deceptive. But I don't say that, because I myself have had religious experiences, both as a reborn Christian and then later as a neo-pagan occultist. And those experiences were much more profound. Yet I noticed that whenever I spoke of my experiences in transcendental meditation, Christians automatically dismissed my testimony outright, as if I was either a deceiver or deceived. Such is their hypocrisy. If some American says that their life just turned around the minute they accepted Jesus, we'd accept that testimony and say hallelujah. But if someone in Thailand says that their life turned around the minute they accepted Buddha, well, then they're confused. They may have experienced something, but it wasn't what they thought. It was probably our devil fooling you. So, religious experiences don't really mean anything to a Christian unless they can find some way to fit it with whatever they already believe. And what I figured out, having had personal experience on every side of this issue, is that faith itself is inherently auto-deceptive. That's the only reason I had these paranormal encounters and so on, because we followed the professor's advice to be more confident about how we might be able to see better with our eyes closed, and unwittingly thus evoke illusions of delusion. When I was a spiritualist, I not only had repeated profound experiences myself, I could even inspire other people to have religious experiences too. All I had to do was set their expectations with the right ambiance, whether it's drums or candles, a Ouija board, sitar music, whatever they needed, and just let their imagination do the rest, like prompting a positive feedback loop. But just like with hypnosis, I couldn't get anybody to see or hear or feel anything they didn't already believe. So I began to realize that I'm not showing anybody anything real. These are only illusions. I'm fooling them, or rather, I'm getting them to fool themselves. I'm setting the stage so that they will fool themselves. And the moment I realized that was the moment I realized I was fooling myself. And I reevaluated all of the tricks, all the demonstrations that I had done with other people to realize how I had been fooling myself. It was a painful realization that all those things I still remember didn't really happen. Not the way I thought they did. Because the mind can be tricked, and it can even trick itself. And that's why, after a half century of research into near-death experiences, we still don't have enough substance to show that there's even a there. Hundreds of accounts, and all but very few of them have clear explanations. And more importantly, again, it comes down to whatever the subject already believes. Christians may see dead relatives or Jesus or a long tunnel of light, but atheists usually don't experience anything at all. And Hindus get to meet with their gods and come back with what they think is proof of reincarnation, which would effectively be proof that Christianity is false. But of course, the professor ignores all that too, saying that all religious experiences are not just evidence of God, but of her God in particular, regardless what Hindus or pagans or anyone else give as their testimony. So again, the testimony doesn't really matter. It only matters if it's Christian or if it matches Christian theology. And just to show how auto-deceptive faith inherently and invariably is, notice where the professor argues that even if religious experience and ordinary sense perception are not analogous, much less homologous, even if you see the gods or phantasms of the wrong religion, and even if the experience is no more than a hallucination born of psychedelic drugs, even then, she says that it still counts as evidence of the supernatural until it is proven not to be. Because again, religion reverses everything and makes you think backward. Not only do we still not have any evidence for a God, we have evidence against God. Not every concept of God, there's a deistic model or two that escapes us, but at least against the God of the Bible and the Quran, because we know for absolutely certain that there was no Adam and Eve. They never existed. The Garden of Eden is just a fable with a moral, an obvious parable, not literal history. And the same goes for the Tower of Babel and Noah's flood and the Exodus and practically every other important story in the Hebrew Bible that Christianity and Islam are both based on. And everything the Bible or the Quran says about the earth in relation to the rest of the cosmos is laughably wrong. But more than that, there is no evidence of souls either. No support for mind-body dualism, neither in neuroscience nor even in philosophy. But we do have substantial evidence against the notion of a soul. And not only are they not possible, as a number of physicists have already shown, but even if they were supernatural, we still have sufficient evidence to show that they're not there. We have evidential objections to theism, matters of demonstrable fact that actually do qualify as evidential, where the professor has only her own wild imagination. And because the professor is religious and religion reverses everything, she assumes, for example, that theism, and specifically Christianity, is the default position. She said so. So that everything that is not explained by science is explained by God. And she also redefines unbelievers as believers in the typical fashion that every Christian uses, of every Christian philosopher anyway. She refers to us as metaphysical naturalists, having the belief that nature is all there is, when in reality, we both accept that our shared reality exists, but she's trying to posit another supernatural alternative reality in addition to that, one that she cannot justify. So rather than giving us a label of believers in non-magic, why don't admit that we don't share her belief in magic? Finally, when I started reading this, I realized that because this woman is a senior lecturer, PhD professor of philosophy, then her vocabulary is going to be beyond that of, say, the New Independent Fundamental Baptists, people like that. But the arguments she uses are otherwise the same as we might get from them, and even though those arguments never worked. But by the time I finished reading her work, I realized that these were actually some of the stupidest arguments, rationalizations I have ever heard. I am legitimately impressed that any educated philosopher could ever make such a vacuous, irrational, illogical argument.